Hugh crouched in the dry trench, fingers embedded in loose dust, eyes on the ridgeline. The air was quiet, not dead. Waiting. In the distance, the wind carried the sound of a broken machine whining against itself. It had been days since they'd seen movement on this sector. Still, the protocol held. Eyes up, head low, weapon within reach, even when your only job was to exist and not get erased. His boots were too tight. The pair he'd requisitioned 2 bases ago had gone missing during the transit. He didn't mind. Pain was real, and real was currency. Downhill from his post, the remnants of the town were visible. Buildings melted at the edges like wax that never had a flame. It had once been a civilian tech node, long before the war made civilians mythical. Now it was a waypoint for survivors, smuggling routes, and sometimes even time jump agents who needed a blind corner to re-enter reality. He wiped a line of sweat from his jaw with the back of his glove. The sun here was constant, but it had that shimmer, subtle, off-angle. This place had been bent too many times. The vortexes left folds like bruises in the fabric of a place, and they hummed just below the threshold of sound. Status? A voice crackled over comm. Hugh thumbed the line. Still, no motion. South vector stable. Copy. Stay sharp, Forbes. Repeater glitching again. Scanners caught something near Collector 6. Hugh didn't reply. He knew the scanners saw ghosts. That didn't mean they were wrong. The quiet broke 5 minutes later. A shimmer along the ridge, a distortion, not light but density, then gone. Hugh had already flicked his rifle's selector twice before standing fully upright, eyes fixed. He waited, counted to 7. Stillness again. He clicked the comm twice. No response. Back at base, the signals were already dying. Bursts of static, irregular pings. Hugh dropped into a jog, boots thudding soft on the dust as he moved across the slope, veering toward the last known location of Collector 6. His HUD flickered, then blanked, then returned with a slight offset. The time skewed back 12 minutes. That meant a skip. He slowed near the blackened tree line. Collector 6 was a monument, tall, skeletal, humming, designed to drink from time itself. He circled left. The grass was flattened recently, and a shadow moved where there shouldn't be any source. Hugh froze. A man stood at the base, arms to the side, wearing a suit that shimmered wrong. Not invisibility, not stealth. Rejection. The world didn't want to see him. Hugh raised his weapon but didn't speak. The figure turned slowly, no sudden moves. His face was visible, yet misaligned. A twin flash echo. One version stood with a neutral expression. The other grinned a split second after. Then the image stabilized. Not your time, the man said, quiet, calm. But you're here. That's enough. Hugh didn't lower the weapon. Identify. Already have. You're tracking me from before your memory loops. I'm Chance. Not mine either. But here we are. Hugh clicked the comm. Nothing. Dead. The man Chance looked to the sky. We've been circling this encounter for a dozen iterations. They made sure you wouldn't remember until this one. Hugh's grip tightened. Who is they? The ones who left us the tech. The ones who taught us to fight with it. The ones who laugh when we use it to kill each other. Hugh moved a half step forward. Chance didn't flinch. You're saying... I'm not saying. I'm reminding. Your memory's fractured. Mine too. Ask yourself this. Who was the first to offer us time jump tech? Who taught us field dampeners? Disruptors? Who never bled when the bullets flew? Hugh opened his mouth, closed it again. I'm not the enemy, Chance said, kneeling and placing a small prism on the ground. But I've worn their suit, once. The prism glowed a low, steady pulse. Around them, the soundscape changed. Hugh heard children laughing. He blinked. The world flickered. The trees weren't burnt anymore. They were green. A woman's voice echoed, calling someone home. Then it was gone. You felt that? Chance stood. Hugh nodded. Barely. They've done this for centuries. Give us tech. Wait. Watch. When we grow too curious, too close, they see to war. Hugh's breath slowed, so we'd kill ourselves before we learned the truth. Chance gave a single nod. You see it now. The sky crackled. Not thunder, more like a choked signal collapsing. Chance looked back to the collector. This is where I leave you. They've spotted me. Hugh stepped forward. Wait, how do I... But the man was already gone. No light, no sound. The shimmer ended. Hugh stood in silence, hand trembling slightly. He didn't report it. Not then. The next day, Griffin returned. His hair was damp, his posture worse. Whatever mission he'd run, it took more than time. The base was on full lockdown. Systems glitching, vortex stabilization erratic. Everyone acted like that was normal. Hugh found him by the perimeter wall, staring out across the empty flatland. You didn't sleep, Hugh said. Griffin nodded. I did, just not all at once. Hugh waited. Griffin turned slightly. You ever wonder why the war doesn't end? Hugh nodded. All the time. Griffin lit a stim stick, offered one. Hugh declined. We lost 712, not just the unit, the whole region. Timeline bled out. Hugh frowned. How? Interceptor fire. We traced the signatures. Not ours. Not theirs. Hugh's heart stuttered. Then who? Griffin looked him dead in the eye. Exactly. Neither spoke for a while. The wind picked up. Inside, the operations room was tense. Red lights blinked at irregular intervals. Reports piled. The memory cubes stacked on the command table were warm to the touch. No one dared sort them yet. A runner approached Hugh later, handed him a sealed slip. Handwritten, rare. It bore Griffin's seal. Field assignment. Immediate. Hugh opened it. His eyes narrowed. The coordinates led back to the outskirts, near Collector 3. He packed light. When he arrived, the area was quiet, but the collector hummed with unnatural rhythm. He scanned. Nothing out of place. Then a glimmer in the grass, a small orb, perfectly smooth, chrome black. It pulsed when he approached. He reached for it. Don't. The voice came from nowhere. Then everywhere. Hugh froze. You were never meant to hold that, it said, but we let one of you get close, a flaw in your kind's chaos. The orb rose from the grass, floated, hovered inches from his face. You are not the virus. You are the vector. Hugh's legs locked. He couldn't move. The war was our fire. You are oxygen. Then silence. The orb dropped, cold again. Hugh backed away, heart pounding, sweat cold. That night, Griffin debriefed in whispers. Not recorded, not logged. You heard them, didn't you? Griffin asked. Hugh nodded. Griffin held a prism in his hand, the same one Chance had shown. It pulsed in rhythm with Hugh's. We're not the first iteration, Griffin said. We're the first to remember. And the world outside the collector walls began to shift again. Hugh didn't sleep. He laid back in the cot, staring at the ceiling, counting the lattice cracks in the overhead plating, as if memorizing them would prevent the walls of his reality from collapsing. Around him, the barracks were quiet. Too quiet for the amount of movement he could feel underfoot. Vibrations. Distant. Rhythmic. Machines. Not ground tremors. Something was being built. At dawn, he bypassed the mess hall and walked the inner wall circuit. New fencing was going up. Drones were perched in place along the high ridgeline, not military, not theirs. Civilian surveillance drones, re-engineered and equipped with low-signature pulse detectors. They weren't watching the enemy anymore. They were watching inward. Griffin met him at the underground lift hours later, alone. No brief, no escort. They rode in silence to the green sector, the research sprawl. The deeper levels were rarely visited by fieldmen. Hugh watched as Griffin unlocked the gate with a prism-embedded baton and a sharp whisper. The door blinked in, not out. They stepped into the pulse chamber. 50-foot ceilings, all dark, no light sources, yet everything was visible. At the center was the unit. A vault the size of a dropship sat buried halfway into the floor. Tubes snaked from its sides, some pulsing with liquid, others glowing like a vein through skin. Monitors surrounded it, showing blurred maps, time-looped faces, fragments of coordinates, and one icon pulsing red, an omega fractured by a vertical slash. What is this? Hugh asked. Where it all starts, Griffin said, walking to the side and waving his hand over a sphere mount. A projection erupted, showing overlapping maps of the Earth, then other worlds, all linked by fine green tendrils. They seeded us with tech, centuries ago, gave us discoveries, progress, power, then waited. Waited for what? For us to build the network they couldn't, for us to connect the gates. Hugh looked up. Time travel was their back door. Griffin nodded. Every vortex, every collector, it's an antenna, not just for power, for communication. With who? Not who. What? Hugh blinked as the vault cracked open. The hiss was low, sad somehow, as if the metal itself mourned what it had been holding. Inside was a human figure. Female, motionless, encased in a translucent field. Her eyes open but glassed over. Her skin glimmered faintly like frost over polished steel. She's been here longer than the war, Griffin said. Not alive. Not exactly. We think, proxy, a translator. But she was built to look like one of us, to comfort us, or fool us. She spoke? Griffin shook his head. But she broadcast, subharmonics. We intercepted them. Took years to decipher. Every piece of technology we adapted from the wreckage. We think it came from her transmissions. And she let us? No. She made us. The transmission included schematics, implants, algorithms. Hugh took a step back. She's not the only one, is she? Griffin didn't answer. He turned and walked toward the far console, flipping a series of switches. The room dimmed as energy drew inward. A wall shimmered and then revealed a memory stream. Not a recording, a captured time echo. It showed the battlefield from 2 decades ago. Hugh watched in silence as soldiers fought, but the weapons were wrong. Too clean, vaporized with beams that made no sound, and floating above the scene, just visible, were rings, metallic, rotating in opposite directions. Inside each, eyes, unblinking, unblinking. Hugh felt his skin go cold. They watched, Griffin said. They watched the entire time, intervened only to keep balance, not peace. Conflict is a power source to them. Hugh stepped closer. Why now? Why are we only seeing this now? Because we started asking the wrong questions at the right time, the kind that pierce back. Griffin turned, handed Hugh a small capsule. Inside, a filament. It shimmered with its own rhythm, ticking like a second heart. Take this to Reclamation Node 5. Drop it inside the collector there. Do not talk. Do not deviate. When you're done, you'll know what we know. Hugh took the capsule. And if I don't want to know? Griffin didn't flinch. You already do. You just don't remember. Outside, the world had begun to glitch again. Hugh walked across the courtyard and realized the sky was subtly different. Colors inverted on the edges, shadows where the light should be. People moved in double exposures, resetting every few steps. No one else noticed. He boarded a scout skiff and headed out. The ride to Node 5 took an hour through the cracked valleys, regions once farmland now mined for fusion dust. The remnants of 3 old wars had built a mountain range from metal alone. At Node 5, the collector stood half-functional. Partially melted, covered in impact scoring. The area had been abandoned for years. Hugh walked in with the capsule clenched in his palm. He reached the node and found the socket Griffin described, a small cube panel, flickering with green light. He opened the capsule and dropped the filament inside. Instantly, the collector pulsed. Hugh staggered back as the world around him bent sharply inward. Sound vanished, vision inverted. And then, he was standing in the same spot, but the sky above was gone. In its place, a black mesh lattice, like a dome. Outside the dome were stars, but wrong. Too many. Moving too fast. And behind them, something watched. It didn't move. It didn't speak. But Hugh knew. The war wasn't the end. It was the farm. The machine around him vibrated with such force that his nose bled. He clutched his ears, fell to his knees. A voice, not from the air but inside his spine, spoke. Your kind was the blade. Now you are the wound. Then he was back, flat on the ground, the collector humming as if nothing happened. He stood slowly. The sky was blue again, real. But now everywhere he looked, he saw ghost impressions of what had been, shadow echoes of the watchers, hanging like mist. He returned to base without logging the trip. Griffin met him near the perimeter. You saw them. Hugh nodded. Griffin whispered, Good, then you're ready. Ready for what? Griffin held out a device. It looked like a detonator, but the counter ran upward. This sets the frequency. Not a weapon, a signal. To call them? To show them we see them. Hugh hesitated. Why not destroy them? Griffin shook his head. They exist across probabilities. They're never there long enough to destroy. But we can interfere. We can jam the signal, break the loop, make Earth opaque. Hugh took the device. Griffin leaned close. They've used humans against each other for eons. This time, one human uses them. The countdown began at Hugh's touch, and somewhere far beyond the collector field, in a place without time, the watchers blinked. Hugh's dreams that night were not dreams. They were overlays. Experiences not lived but embedded, poured into him like data down a failing conduit. He saw his childhood, but wrong. His mother's face was out of focus. Her mouth moved, but the words were not in any language he knew, and yet he understood. He saw Griffin before he'd ever met Griffin. Younger, cleaner, still wearing both his arms. He saw the collector field stretching across continents like neural veins, and hovering above them, always just out of reach, were the rings. When he woke, the counter on the device had stopped. It blinked once, then vanished, leaving a blank screen and a subtle warmth in his pocket, like it had never existed. He looked around the barracks. 4 cots empty. 4 fieldmen gone. No alerts, no alarms. He checked his HUD. No mention of them. No logs. Erased or never there. He walked into Central Ops to find the command deck in full lockdown. Griffin stood before a newly constructed DAS. Floating above it were 3 memory cubes, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. No one else moved. All around, texts stood still, eyes distant, mouths shut, like statues waiting to be rewound. Griffin turned when Hugh entered, his eyes bloodshot, not from fatigue, but exposure. "They struck back," he said flatly. "They killed this timeline." Hugh blinked. "What?" Griffin gestured at the cubes. "3 anchors, fragments of 3 concurrent time branches that still remember this version of events. The rest are collapsing. We're in a localized breach. We have maybe 12 hours before the station loses alignment and gets absorbed." Hugh stepped forward. "Then we evacuate." Griffin didn't move. "No, we consolidate. We've found something. A map, not of time, but of cause." Hugh stood beside him now, the cubes flickering softly, projecting a field. The hologram showed a spiral, not linear, but coiled, like a vortex looped into itself. Events orbited the center, sometimes merging, sometimes repelling. Hugh saw events he remembered, and ones he didn't, but knew. His hand passed through one, and it burned. Static bled into his skin. Griffin gestured again. A new loop emerged. This one was pulsing in red. "That's them," he said. Hugh stared. "A timeline?" "No. A bypass. A false continuity. It masquerades as time, but it's a logic tunnel. They hide inside the assumptions we refuse to challenge." Hugh understood now. They're not just using tech, they're using belief. Griffin nodded. "Everything we assumed about the war, about origin, about alliance, it's all engineered. The real timeline, the true causal strand, is buried underneath their planted events. If we can unearth the original divergence, we might trap them." "How?" Griffin placed a 4th cube on the dais. This one was black. "We create a false loop, a bait line. We simulated a divergence so catastrophic they can't ignore it. Something irresistible, something that threatens their design." Hugh frowned. "And what would that be?" Griffin looked him dead in the eye. "You." Hugh felt it before he accepted it. Something in him had changed. The Watchers had touched him, marked him. Not infected, enhanced. He could feel the gaps in logic around him now, like holes in glass. "We use you to rewrite the bait line," Griffin continued. "A series of events where you gain control of the vortex lattice, where you unify the collector fields, where you collapse the war not by peace, but by coherence, a new frequency." Hugh was silent. Then, "Won't they see it?" Griffin grinned. "That's the point. When they enter the loop to interfere, we close it, with this." He revealed a shard, metallic, humanoid in shape but abstract, a sculpture, or maybe a key. Its edges glowed softly like ice over a dying ember. "What is it?" "An anchor, from before, from the original strand." Hugh took it. It was warm and cold, heavy and light, impossible. Griffin handed him a small packet. Inside, a pulse trigger and a single-use vortex drive. "You'll jump to the coordinates in 10 minutes. You'll arrive 2 weeks before the Catalyst event. Set the stage. Let them see you rise. Let them think they've won. And when they enter, you'll know." Hugh didn't say goodbye. He never liked endings. He activated the jump. Time folded. He landed hard. Dust stung his eyes. The sky was orange, veined with stormlight. He was in the southern basin, just outside what would become the Spire base. Only it hadn't been built yet. Around him, civilians worked tirelessly, constructing, trading, surviving. It was a time of hope, and that made it all the more dangerous. Hugh infiltrated fast. His rank carried over, records aligned to support his presence. He began to manipulate key events, traded black market schematics that intercepted skirmish orders, diffused 3 false flag attacks. He rose fast, as predicted. The timeline adjusted, stretched, reshaped. Eyes turned to him, and then they came. Not ships, not soldiers, observers. People who didn't exist in census data. Faces you never remembered. Conversations that evaporated as soon as they ended. Smiles that didn't reach the eyes. They watched Hugh from every corner of his world. He let them. He even spoke to one in the old library beneath the basin. She wore no insignia. Her smile was correct, not warm, not cold, just expected. "You are deviating," she said. "I'm adapting," Hugh replied. "Your deviation is spreading." He nodded. "That's the point. You risk recursive decay. You risk being seen." She paused. Her eyes flickered just once. That was enough. "We see you, Hugh Forbes." "I see you too." She left. Hugh returned to base. The moment the observers gathered to vote interference, he activated the prism. The timeline snapped. The trap closed. Inside the collector ring, space bent like breath against ice. The Watchers were pulled in, not by force, but inevitability. Their assumptions made them vulnerable. Their own map was used against them. Griffin's voice echoed in the comms. "They're caught. Locked in a causal echo. They'll loop endlessly." Hugh didn't celebrate. He stood at the edge of the ring, watching the vortex pulse. He saw the events repeat. War, peace, manipulation, rebellion, trapped now, unable to project forward. Then silence. Griffin arrived hours later, limping from a collapsed jump zone. "You did it," he said. Hugh looked up. "No, we paused them." Griffin nodded. "Long enough." "For what?" "To remember who we were before they rode over us." Hugh turned back to the ring and waited. Days passed, then weeks. The world outside didn't quite return to normal. It couldn't. Too much had unraveled. The war slowed but didn't stop. The engines of conflict sputtered without the Watchers' fuel, but hatred was an ember that burned under its own heat. Still, something had shifted. The time distortions stabilized. Vortexes no longer formed at random. The collector fields lost their aggression, humming now with a passive stillness, like hibernating beasts. Power grids reconnected. Messages from broken timelines blinked back to life, glitchy but intact. People remembered things that had never happened. Others forgot things they lived through. Hugh wandered the northern sector of the base one morning, watching children play along the scaffolding of a half-finished tower. They were building again. That mattered. He met Griffin at the perimeter wall, just as he had the day of his awakening. This time, there were no weapons between them. Just memory. "Tell me again," Griffin said, leaning on a pipe. "What did she say?" "The observer." Hugh scratched his chin. "She said I was deviating." Griffin smiled. "That's the closest thing to a compliment they've ever given." They stood in silence, watching the horizon. Off in the distance, the collapsed shell of the set's former stronghold glittered in the morning light. Its command lines still crawled across the hillsides, fossilized AI script etched into the earth like old scars. The signal towers had gone quiet. No more pulses, no more updates from beyond. Griffin reached into his coat and handed Hugh a small box. Inside was a fragment of one of the green-streaked memory cubes, shattered, dead. It shimmered faintly but with no pulse. A relic. "What's this?" "A reminder," Griffin said, "of what we forgot, and what we broke to remember it." Hugh closed the box. "Will they come back?" "Probably, eventually, but not in the same form. They can't run the same script twice. Now that we've seen them, they have to change their mask." Hugh nodded. "So what happens now?" Griffin's gaze lingered on the sky. "We rebuild. We decentralize. We bury what we must, and we archive what we can. And we don't forget again." That afternoon, the Council of Sectors gathered for the first time in 10 years. Not a war council, not a supply command. A forum. Each representative seated without armor, without rank insignia, only their lived memories and fractured truths. Hugh stood before them, uninvited but not unwelcome. He spoke plainly. There was a war, but not the one we fought. The true war was over control of perception, of memory, of possibility, and we lost for a time. Silence, but now we're not being watched. Not yet, and this is our chance to decide who we become. He stepped down, no applause, but nods, real ones. That was enough. Later that evening, Griffin took Hugh to the sublevels, to the room where the sleeper remained. She hadn't moved since the disruption. The field around her was dimming, a flicker at the edges. They'd begun dismantling the chamber. "She wasn't one of them," Griffin said softly, "but she wasn't one of us either." Hugh approached the field, looked into her eyes. There was something there now. A flicker, a blink. She saw him. He stepped back. "We should end it." Griffin nodded. "We will." The chamber lights dimmed. The encasement powered down. For the first time in years, the hum ceased. Outside, the base slowly returned to function. The collector fields were reprogrammed to track history, not distort it. Records were rebuilt, memory cubes re-indexed and sealed, and the spires, those strange, towering relics of the set's influence, were stripped down and turned into signal buoys. Beacons of caution. A warning. Hugh returned to the field corps, but not as a soldier. He walked from zone to zone, speaking, listening, learning what had survived and what had changed. Some towns had no memory of the war. Others remembered wars that never existed. Each version of truth had weight. At the edge of the eastern ridge, Hugh sat with a boy no older than 10, watching a glider drone circle overhead. "Is that thing dangerous?" the boy asked. "It used to be," Hugh said. "Now it's just watching." The boy made a face. "Like the bad watchers?" Hugh smiled. "No, this one listens. It learns." The boy looked curious. "From who?" Hugh pointed at him. "From you." Far off in space, just beyond the visible edge, an echo folded back in on itself. A logic loop failed to close. Somewhere in the mesh between universes, a dead signal flared and went out. Back on Earth, life moved forward. And for the first time in generations, the future wasn't written, it would be told. There was a silence growing beneath the world. Beneath the crust of reclaimed cities, under collector stations now long dormant, deep in tunnels carved out during the height of the war, something had gone quiet. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of things waiting. Hugh stood before the archive vault, key filament pressed to the lock, listening to the mechanical whispers of the security lattice folding away. This was the last node they hadn't explored since the Watchers fell into their loop, not out of fear, out of caution. It was said this one held the raw pre-collapse logs, untouched, unscrubbed, unfiltered. He wasn't alone. Woody was with him now, older, slower, his leg fitted with a bypass implant that clicked as he walked. But his eyes still sparked. "You think it'll change what we know?" Woody asked. "I think it might show us what we missed," Hugh replied. Inside, the vault breathed. Lines of prisms and filament libraries stretched wall to wall. Everything shimmered with latent data, and at the heart of it an orb, dormant but intact, embedded in a slab of old-world alloy, pulsing faintly like a sleeping heart. Hugh approached it, no scripts activated, no alerts. It led him near. He placed his palm on it. Static ran up his spine. Images hit him in frames. The first city, the first seed. The first whisper of foreign design implanted into Earth's grid under the guise of a solar alignment project. Then the black rains, then the first clean war, then the first altered memory. And behind it all, shapes. Not creatures, not ships, motifs. Patterns of logic that birthed technologies and fed ideologies. They weren't watchers, they were shepherds or farmers. Hugh pulled his hand away. The orb quieted. "God," Woody said. "We were the crops." "No," Hugh corrected, standing slowly. "We were the soil." They returned to base under the veil of a mild dust storm. No alarms, no debriefing, only silence from those who waited. Griffin met them, already knowing, his face drawn sunken, like he'd read it all through the static. "We can't destroy it," Hugh said. Griffin nodded. "I wouldn't ask us to." "What now? We reframe the timeline." Hugh raised a brow. "We admit the truth," Griffin continued, "to everyone. No more classified loops, no more time-layered missions, and no more grooming the future like we're shaping it. That'll shatter half the command." Griffin smiled without warmth. That half was already cracked. The announcement came 2 days later, a broadcast shared openly across all regions. Hugh stood before the array, wind at his back, voice steady. "We were shaped, engineered, but we were never owned." He paused. Let it sink in. The Watchers didn't lose, they were paused. But we must learn, because they never stopped preparing us for themselves. We must build a world where interference is impossible, not just hidden. He stared into the lens, unblinking, and we begin with memory. All of it. Every truth, every fracture, every false timeline. We record it, we teach it, we write it down so the next era won't be born blind. That day, the base began the archive. Every survivor submitted their story. Some spoke in rage, others wept. Others simply recited what they remembered. But they spoke. For the first time, they owned their memory. Hugh watched from the catwalk above as fieldmen and civilians alike lined up to add their voices. Even the old set officers, long disbanded, were there, humbled. Griffin stood beside him. "Do you believe it'll hold?" Hugh didn't answer right away. "No." Griffin tilted his head. "But I believe they'll try," Hugh said. "And that's enough." In the shadows of the collector fields, now dismantled and rusting in the sun, children ran without weapons. The sound of their feet was real, not fabricated, not repeated from a forgotten timeline. Real. The walls of the base, once humming with vortex interference and cloaked in disruptor fields, now bore murals, a timeline made of images, not loops. Art told the story. The field code from the fallen timeline had been transcribed into poetry. The names of the lost engraved along the northern barricade, which now stood not to protect, but to remember. And in a chamber far below, sealed in silence, the anchor sat, no longer needed, but never discarded, because even peace, when earned, needs a keystone. Hugh left the base one final time, not in retreat, not in exile, but in purpose. Across the fractured lands were still untouched towns, wild colonies, survivors uncounted. He would walk until his name was forgotten, until his story was retold by those who never knew him. That was how memory healed. Not by being preserved perfectly, but by being handed forward, flawed, and still beating. The last image of Hugh, recorded in the archive, was a simple one. A man standing at the edge of a broken road, pack slung over one shoulder, looking ahead, and in the distance, a sky that no longer shimmered. Somewhere far above the atmosphere, where no collectors reached, where even the time loops hadn't curled, the last fragment of the Watcher's architecture floated. It was not a ship, not in any human sense. It was a vessel of probability, a skein of possibility woven tight into a field of shifting potential. It did not move through space, it moved through assumption. Where belief was strong enough, it appeared. Where doubt crept in, it flickered out. But something was wrong now. Inside this structure, the inhabitants, or remnants, processed pattern collapses at blinding speeds. They projected shadow selves into still looping fragments of old Earth, seeking resonance. But the resonance was gone. The lattice had been severed. Hugh's act, the trigger Griffin handed him, the field disruption seeded into the fake loop, had done more than trap them. It had taught the world to question, and doubt was fatal to the Watchers. Within the vessel, one node pulsed erratic. The shape inside, a humanoid approximation crafted to better observe those who evolved through struggle, shivered. "You deviated," the node said aloud. There was no response. Deviant vector has spawned replications. Local thought-form environments no longer reinforce the assumed chain. Silence. The subject vector has ignited recursive free agency nodes. Authority structures collapsing. Absorption impossible. Still silence. The figure tilted its head. Begin observer shutdown. We will attempt re-entry through a lower assumption tier. And the ship dimmed. On Earth, Griffin received the signal hours before sunrise. He read the data burst 3 times before speaking. They've gone under. Hugh was across the continent now, helping rebuild the aquifer maps and reestablish grain corridors, but his signal returned in less than a minute. Gone where? Beneath awareness. They're going dark, waiting to be believed in again. Hugh responded simply, "Then we stop worshipping ghosts." The last phase began not with a war, but with a school. A single building set into the old ruins of what was once a set outpost, now ringed with gardens and water channels. Its walls were painted with the words of 100 timelines, all jumbled, forming a new whole. Students came from all sectors, some whose ancestors had been on the wrong side of the war, others from fringe colonies who'd barely survived. They weren't told what to believe, they were told to remember and to question. Hugh taught there only once a year. He sat on the floor, never behind a lectern. He told stories. The truth of them didn't matter as much as the questions they raised. The one he always ended with went like this. "There was a day once," he said, "when someone asked what would happen if we stopped reacting, stopped assuming the enemy was each other, and the answer came. Quiet, simple, unavoidable." He waited. Someone always asked, what was the answer? He smiled. We remembered who we were, and they couldn't survive that. That night, the stars flickered in the sky, not from battle, not from interference, but from alignment. A pattern locked into place, a story completed, a loop broken not by force, but by letting go, and so ended the first book, not with a final battle, but with a final breath, a return to self, a knowing. The Watchers waited, but no one came back. Years passed, not in silence, but in motion, rebuilding, reconnection, relearning. The surface of the earth no longer bore the sharp scars of war, but it did not forget them. Roads etched with blast lines had become market lanes. Collector ruins turned into sanctuaries, each one a circle of stone and steel where people told stories and sang of timelines they'd never lived, but now somehow remembered. Hugh grew older. The man once shadowed by weaponry and war had grown into something else. Not a leader, not even a figurehead, but a presence. People didn't salute him. They asked him questions. He didn't give orders. He asked better questions in return. He rarely stayed in one place longer than a season. One winter in the southern terraces building floodgates with teenage engineers. Another summer on the central plateau, helping construct transmitter towers that no longer aimed to call out to watchers, but to call across one another. Pure communication, human to human. No lords overhead, no silent witnesses in orbit. Children now grew up knowing the war as a shadow, not a monster. They played games where the monsters were defeated not with weapons, but by seeing them clearly, naming them aloud, and choosing to walk past. In the city of Orlan, a rebuilt trade hub over one of the oldest collector fields, Hugh met a woman named Ray. She was tall, quiet-eyed and burned metal into poetry. Her sculptures stood over intersections, phrases twisted from salvaged steel and old war plates. Truth is memory untied from fear. All gods can be doubted. Do not kneel to patterns. They built a home above the old glider station. Together, they uncovered part of a dormant set data vault, one the reclamation crews had missed. It wasn't functional. The memory lattice had long since degraded, but inside it were dozens of spools, paper-thin and etched in a language neither fully recognized. Ray spent 3 years translating it line by line. It was a confession from one of the first hybrid observers. I did not believe they would ever fall, but they feared something we could not quantify, the human act of doubt. Not doubt as despair, doubt as resistance, as anti-programming, as self-definition. Once a mind learns to doubt a loop, the loop breaks. This is not rebellion, it is evolution. That is the fracture they feared. The virus we seeded and forgot. They published the text, not as scripture, as reference. One day, Hugh stood at the high balcony and watched the sky. He had no agenda. The watchers hadn't returned. But sometimes you had to look anyway. Not out of fear, out of responsibility. He turned to find Griffin there. The older man had grayed, lost mass, gained vision. "They're not coming," Hugh said. Griffin nodded. "Not soon. Not in form." Hugh tilted his head. "Still afraid of us?" "No," Griffin said. "Afraid we'll teach others what we learned." And that was the truth. The war hadn't been between species. It had been a war between realities, between those who needed control and those who had learned to live without it. Griffin handed him a small black stone. "Polished, seamless. What is it?" Hugh asked. "A fragment, from the edge of the echo lattice, still warm." Hugh felt it hum in his palm. "Does it do anything?" Griffin smirked. "Only if you give it orders." Hugh tossed it to Ray later that night. She caught it in one hand, studied it under firelight, and buried it in a planter box beneath a plum tree. That spring, the tree flowered early. The petals glowed faintly. No one asked why. In time, the archives were expanded. Not just war records, not just memory loops, not just field notes, but stories. Folklore born from fractured truths, children's books retelling old timelines as parables, maps drawn from memory and dream together. Hugh read a page one morning while walking the sky bridge above Orlan. Once the world was a knot of forgetting, then someone pulled a thread and looked inside. He smiled. He knew the writer, a girl who'd grown up beneath the burnt towers of the northern fields. Her story was new. Hers alone. In the last years of his life, Hugh never stopped moving. He walked from valley to spire to desert edge, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, sometimes just planting something in the dirt and walking away. When he died, there was no monument, no funeral pyre, no military fanfare. But across the land, in every outpost and commune and memory station, bells rang once at the hour of dusk, not for mourning, for signal clarity, to say, we remember, we remain, we deviate. And far above the earth, beyond any collector field's range, in a space where time once bent to foreign will, the watchers sat dormant still. Their nodes quivered as a signal breached their loops, soft, slow, human. Not a threat, a question. Are you still watching? No reply, and none was needed, because the question itself meant we're no longer waiting. Somewhere across a barren world that once wore the same sky as Earth, a man walked beneath unfamiliar constellations. He wasn't Hugh, not anymore. His name had dissolved over time, a sound turned to silence by years of walking, listening, remembering. He wore a weathered jacket stitched from old field cloth and new fiber, and in his chest he carried a shard of the old world, not as a weapon, not as proof, but as a thread, a reminder that no strand of history was ever fully cut. This was not Earth. Not exactly. It was one of the spill worlds, those branched planets created during the war, when the Watchers had bent the lattice so far it fractured into physical space. Some spill worlds had collapsed. Others had matured into strange reflections. This one had lived, and it had grown. The settlers here knew of the war, though not firsthand. They had never seen the collectors. They had never bled beneath the vortex storms, but they knew the stories. The archive, now encoded into deep orbit repeater pods, had reached them generations ago. The people here had adapted the lessons, built without hierarchy, structured their cities with centers, not tops, named their children after doubts, not heroes. And now, the man with no name walked their roads. He wasn't a prophet. They didn't treat him like one. He was an echo, a fragment, a living strand of the thread they'd inherited. On his third day in the capital ring, he stood beneath a tower of glass grown directly from volcanic stone. The structure resonated faintly, tuned to vibrations across the planetary field. It was a listening post, but not for signals. It listened to memory. He sat in the center and waited. A child approached. Not out of awe, out of curiosity. "Is it true," she asked, "that you spoke with the machines?" He smiled. "No," she frowned. "But you stopped them." "No," he said again, gently. "We stopped ourselves. That's what made them powerless." She didn't quite understand, but she nodded anyway. The tower shifted pitch. Something beyond language passed through the room. Not a message, a feeling. Deep acknowledgement. Somewhere, the archive in orbit adjusted its rotation. The signal beam moved 1 degree west. The loop had registered a null return. Not silence. Completion. Elsewhere, on Earth and on other worlds now growing in the void, the Watcher's logic forms began to erode. Not from an attack, from neglect. They had been forgotten. A single beacon blinked once in a dead region of space, then expired. Back on the spill world, the man walked out of the listening tower, the child following. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Write new myths," he said. "About what?" "Not about the end," he said, turning. "About what we did after the end." The wind carried his voice across the basalt plain, and in time, the world followed. In a chamber so deep beneath Earth's crust it existed between measurable frequencies, an ancient structure shuddered, not from damage, from awakening. Inside, dormant files, fragments of Watcher protocols, scanned for instruction, for pattern, for resonance. They found none, but one thread remained active. Hugh Forbes, status unknown. The Lattice attempted a query. It failed. A secondary command was initiated. Seed contingency, pattern unknowable. A warning flared and extinguished itself. Threat class human defined. And then watch protocol obsolete. Final process activated, handshake rejected. Archive yielded. And thus, the last Watcher node became what it had feared most. A listener. No longer a hand over humanity. Just a record, just a relic. Back on the surface, under a sky no longer charted by war, a generation not born from blood gathered in open fields to speak, to build, to err, to create. They made no gods, they made no enemies, they made a story. And in its telling, everything that once ruled them fell quiet. Not gone, but no longer needed. And the world moved forward, not toward peace or power, but toward awareness. The final war had not been won, it had been understood. And understanding was a weapon no loop could counter.